Hello, Man in Gray here with another Man in Gray book review. Today's book is The Optimism Bias, a tour of the irrationally positive brain by Tali Sharot, published in 2011 by Pantheon Books. It's 250 pages long. Why do people smoke when they know that smoking causes lung cancer, emphysema, it increases your chance of heart attacks and strokes? It basically degrades your health. Why do people ride motorcycles without wearing helmets, even though they know that not wearing a helmet greatly increases your chance of being killed if you're in an accident? Why do some people sign up for auditions for singing talent shows when they can't carry a tune? Well, the answer to all these things is something called the optimism bias. That's the tendency to think that you're more talented, that you have greater abilities than you actually have, and to disregard or devalue your limitations. Right? It's also a tendency to think that good things will happen to you more likely than bad things. And the author of this book, Tali Sharot, is a psychologist and a neurologist who spent years studying this tendency of optimism bias. Why do we have it? Why do so many people have it? Not everyone has an optimism bias, but the vast majority of people do. One of the experiments she talks about in here is asking people how good a driver they are. Are you in the bottom 25% of driving ability, or are you in the top 25% or whatever? And almost every time she's done this survey, the majority of people, over half, rate themselves as in the top 25% of driving ability. Hardly anybody wants to consider themselves to be a bad driver. Well, it's not possible for half of everybody to be in the top 25% mathematically, right? So that's what that's about. It's the optimism bias. Now, it turns out there is a biological basis for this. Our brains tend to be hardwired toward optimism, toward thinking things are going to work out. Right, and the way that she and her colleagues found this out is by putting people in functional MRI scanners, fMRIs. fMRIs allow you to study brain activity in real time. So they put volunteers in an fMRI machine and then told them positive things, like if they thought their chances of getting cancer was 40 or 50%. The average chance of getting cancer is actually 30%. So when people were told positive things that went against their beliefs, the things that they were being too negative on themselves, when they were given positive news, their brain was much, much more active. But when they were given negative news, if people thought their chances of getting cancer were only 15 or 20%, and they're told it's actually 30 on average, their brain is much less active. So our brain tends to light up more, tends to be more active when we hear news we want to hear. And we tend to be less active when we hear news we don't want to hear. This is also something called confirmation bias. It helps explain that. Confirmation bias is when you only believe things that you want to believe. And if you're given information that goes against what you want to believe, you tend to disregard it. Right? So if you're told, for example, that smoking is going to raise your chance of lung cancer and emphysema, you'll say, oh, it's not going to happen to me. Because there's always some people who do smoke and never get cancer and never get emphysema. And smokers tend to think, well, I'm going to be that person that doesn't do that. Some people don't get vaccinated because they don't think they'll ever get sick. And of course, motorcycle drivers without helmets don't think they'll ever be in a wreck. I'm not going to be the person who gets in a crash. I'm a good driver, and so forth. Okay, so why do we have this? Why is the brain hardwired to be optimistic? Well, there's research that Sharot and her collaborators did on this as well. And one of the things they found is that people who are optimistic, who have this optimism bias, tend to take risks that they wouldn't take otherwise, which means that sometimes they become much more successful. And a good example of that is Barack Obama's 2008, Barack Obama's 2008 campaign for president. On the surface of it, if you look at it realistically, he didn't have much of a chance of running and being president. Barack Obama, there had never been, of course, a black president prior to Barack Obama. And there was only one really serious attempt by black person to run for president. That was Jesse Jackson back in the 1980s. And he didn't get very far because he had difficulty raising money, and he had difficulty getting a campaign staff together. There's only so many people, so many talented, experienced people that can run staffs, and he had trouble getting that. So on the surface, it would think that this would be a huge burden. In addition to that, Barack Obama knew that he was going to have to face off against Hillary Clinton, a woman who had a great name recognition, who had a much better resume than Barack Obama did, and who had the support of a lot of Democratic fundraisers and leaders and people in Congress and so forth. And then he also knew that if he did manage to get past Hillary Clinton, he was going to probably have to face John McCain in the general election, a man who was a war hero, a man who'd been in Congress for years, and a man who was quite charismatic. So if Barack Obama had been more realistic, he might have said, well, I need to wait. I don't need to run right now. I need to wait until this election's over with, stay in Congress, get some more experience. At the time, Barack Obama had only been in the Senate for a year. And prior to that, his only governmental experience had been a few years as a state senator in Illinois. So he had a really thin resume to run on. And so the more realistic thing would have said, wait a little bit, stay in the Senate, get some more experience, and wait for Hillary Clinton to do her thing and John McCain to run, and then run later. But he said, no, I'm going to run now because I think I can win. And he did. He defeated Hillary Clinton, and then he defeated John McCain and became the first black president. Now, he wouldn't have done that unless he'd had a bias toward optimism. Right? And so that's one of the reasons, that's one of the benefits of having this. Now, it appears that one of the reasons we're hardwired for this is there is this evolutionary benefit to being optimistic. If you try to imagine, for example, an ancestor of ours in the African savannah thousands and thousands of years ago, and this ancestor of ours is being chased by a predator. Let's say it's a lion. Okay. Well, if the ancestor is optimistic, they're going to think, there's a lion after me, but I can outrun it. Or maybe I can climb this tree and the lion won't catch me. All right. If the ancestor was pessimistic, they'd say, I'm doomed. There's no way I can outrun this. This lion's going to catch me. Well, if you're a pessimist, you're going to be caught by the lion and killed and eaten. Now, if you're an optimist, you still might be caught by the lion and killed, but you have a better chance of escaping because you're not going to give up. And that's another thing that Sharot found in her studies, is that optimistic people tend to try harder. They don't give up as easily. And so that means that optimists over time tend to have a higher survival value. And so that means that they pass on their genes to the following generation more. If you're killed and eaten at a young age, you don't have a chance to reproduce. Where if you manage to escape the lion, then you're going to be able to pass your genes on. And so over thousands of years, this genetic tendency toward optimism has built up in the population, so that the majority of people tend to have this optimism bias. And so there are some big advantages to being optimistic. You work harder, you tend to be healthier. People with an optimistic bias tend to have longer lives and have healthier bodies, which also means they're likely to pass more offspring on than people that live a shorter lifetime and are less healthy. Right? Now, I mentioned most people have optimism bias, but not everyone does. Some people's brains are wired differently than the majority of humans. People that suffer from chronic depression tend to be much more realistic about their chances. In fact, they tend to also be somewhat depressed. More depressed than average people. And so when you put them in an fMRI machine and you tell them positive news, their brain doesn't light up nearly as much as the average person does. If you give them negative information, their brain lights up more. It's more active than optimistic people would be. So this gives us an insight into how depressed people are different. Their brains work differently. They think, they view the world differently. They process data differently than other people do. So this is a really fascinating book. There's a lot of repetition in it. The basic information that I've just discussed is given in the first 3 or 4 chapters. And then the other chapters are basically expand on that. They give some more examples and stuff. And so really, probably the second half of the book is mainly padding. You don't really learn anything new in the second half of the book. but it does give you more details. And I found that to be true with a lot of nonfiction books that I've read over the years, is that the vast majority of the information that you really want is usually in the first 2 or 3 chapters. And then if you keep reading, you just get reinforcement. So a lot of nonfiction books start out as magazine articles, and then they're expanded into books. And so they try to pad out the material to get enough pages for a book. This is a 250-page book, which is not short, but it's not a long book. And even so, it's got a lot of padding in it because it has a fairly narrow focus. Nevertheless, I think this is a very interesting book, very insightful. She does mention some things you can do to kind of reach a balance here, because once again, you don't want to be too optimistic. You don't want to. There's always people. Another great example is people who spend a huge amount of money through their lifetime buying lottery tickets, even though they know logically that their chances of winning the big lottery prize is almost nil. It's millions to one, and yet they optimistically think, well, somebody has to win. Why not me? Well, the reason it's not you is because the odds are so small, right? And also being really optimistic can cause you to fail to take adequate planning. For example, you have some people who know they've got terminal cancer, but they're in denial about it. And so they don't bother making out a will or any kind of planning. And so they die, without leaving a will behind, and their estate is a mess, and it takes a long time to straighten out things. And it's really hard on their survivors because we don't know what the person who died wanted to do with their estate. And that's because they're so optimistic they think they're going to beat terminal cancer. And no one beats death. Everybody knows that psychologically, but we don't want to think about it. So the thing about the optimism bias is sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not. And the thing that Sharot points out in this book is that knowing that you have an optimism bias and knowing the facts will help you decide on when to be optimistic and when not to, right? When should you keep trying even though you fail, don't give up? And when should you give up, right? At one point, do you want to quit butting your head against the wall and say, well, I'm not getting anywhere. I need to do something else. But if you give up the first time you reach a difficulty, then you're not going to accomplish much in life either. So there has to be a balance between being persistent, having grit, but also knowing when to give up. And so this book also talks about that as well. So all in all, I think this is a book that, even though it's a little repetitious in some areas, it's written in a very understandable way. She's a very good writer, and the ideas behind it are really fascinating. The book is The Optimism Bias, and the author is Tali Sharot. And this has been another Man in Gray book review. Thanks for watching.